Hey everyone, Sumo Spiffy here. With March 2025 over, that's another basho down, and another basho Yokozuna didn't make it to the end. It's okay though. Now we get to look at all the predictions that went well, pretty well, and yeah. The elephant's in the room, so let's deal with it and get it out of here. Hoshoryu was fine. He turned in the kind of performance that we all expected out of non-Yokozuna Hoshoryu. His first two losses were not at all abnormal. Abi's won 4 of their last 5, and Takayasu flattens him consistently. Chiyoshima showed what all those years of Henka practice were for, and, that happens, but the Ichi Yamamoto loss looked like the pressure had annihilated his sumo senses. Not only did he go for what looked like a planned throw, he followed through with the idea despite not securing the belt and thus having no leverage. If he was still in Ozeki, he could have still lost the other 3, but probably not this one. More importantly, although his arm was bandaged up and I'm sure the elbow injury he reported was real, there's no way he drops out if he's still in Ozeki. The only pressure on him as an Ozeki is to get a winning record, and even from 5-4, he almost certainly scores 8 wins. But going into day 10, his best case scenario was probably 9-6, depending on the severity of his injury, and that's not a place you want to be as a Yokozuna. So he dipped. And this is the issue that lies squarely at the feet of Takatagawa, the Yokozuna Council, and whoever else forced the promotion through, putting a good young wrestler in a position where the fans can't watch him fight because he and his team have to decide if he can reach a Yokozuna standard rather than just let him loose to do the best he can. They'll never have to answer for it, but they should. Onosato gets an obvious bump from A to S tier, which really just means the guy we knew would do well completely popped off again. It's hard to be more S tier than hitting 12 wins when no one else in the Sanyaku reaches double digits. He's the man of the hour, and yet there's so little to say. He did what we know he can do, and the question is why it's only happening every second or third basho. Aonishiki. In a sense, Aonishiki's performance was fully in line with expectations. In another sense, it very much was not. 11 wins seemed entirely plausible, but they would probably come with a red-hot start and some tough losses later on. Instead, nerves got him beat the first 2 days, he lost to Ryuden with a move that I think a lot of guys forget exists, and other than that, he blew through pretty much everyone. Granted, the 2-3 start delayed the expected upgrade to his schedule, but he beat the best Meisei we've seen in a year, Takerufuji and Oho. More importantly, unlike some of his high-flying peers in the lower ranks, he looked like he could repeat these wins again and again. The Ryuden and Daisho losses show he's going to have to learn where the holes in his game are, and I could see tricksters like Tobi and Ura giving him unexpected problems, but his current trajectory is angled pretty far up. Takerufuji slides from A to B tier with a basho that was a little hard to figure out. He didn't take an obvious injury, and going from 9-2 to 9-4 off losses to Onosato and a resurgent Kotozakura seemed entirely reasonable. Even dropping matches to Aonishiki and Wakamoto Haru at the end, on paper, doesn't look awful. But Izugahama Stable is pretty good at getting their guys ready, which made it puzzling to see Takeru try a slapdown against Aonishiki, considering Aonishiki's preternatural ability to maintain balance while bent over almost 90 degrees. Then, once Wakamoto Haru drove forward, he showed essentially no resistance. His kryptonite is clearly strong opponents who get inside and can move him back, and now that everyone seems to know it, he's going to have to find an answer before he can reach the heights we'd hoped to see after that debut Yusho last year. Kotozakura. Like Onosato, for a marquee name, there's not a lot to say about Koto at the moment. He wins when he can press forward, but if an opponent escapes the initial attack, like Abi and Takanosho did, he's vulnerable as soon as they start moving him backwards. Daisho was the only guy he beat while having to really plant his feet and drop his weight, and in that case he got his right foot back, so he was able to brace with his good knee. We know what he can do when healthy, so expect him to remain A injury tier until he either recovers or it looks like his knee isn't going to improve. Daisho and Hakuoho. The two healthy B tier guys did exactly as expected. Daisho continued to be exceptionally consistent, going 9-6 with Gonoyama as his only surprising loss. Given their ranks, Churanaumi should be a surprising loss as well, but somehow dude is 3-0 against Daisho, go figure. Hakuoho's 9 wins were mainly against guys he's expected to toast. Onokatsu was the only opponent he beat who's given him issues in the past, and Churanaumi was the only loss to someone he'd beaten more than once. I've been saying we'll get a better read on where he is physically 2 years after his shoulder surgery, which will be after the July Basho. But that's not going to matter if he doesn't figure out how to deal with mega pushers like Tamawashi and Kinbozan. Next, all the B tier injury guys. And the only place to start here is with Mega S tier Takayasu. This is why I had Papa Bear at S injury tier for a while. When he's healthy and whole, especially when he's not getting Sanyaku clapped right off the start, he can be an absolute force. But it had been so long since we saw that version of him that there was no reason to think it would ever return. I'm sad for him that he still couldn't win the cup, but I'm thrilled to be wrong about the prediction. Wakataka Kage and Wakamoto Haru were essentially like Daisho and Hakuoho, except with more health questions coming into the tournament. Wakataka Kage, like Daisho, is incredibly consistent. Hell, he mirrored his last tournament at Maegashira 1 East for the first 9 days, and that tournament was 3 years ago. Basically, the Sanyaku is tough for him and everyone else is lunch. I know it can seem like a prediction of a winning record is wrong if someone's not winning from jump, but in Wakataka Kage's case, I would have been surprised if he did this in some fashion other than turning around a slow start. Wakamoto Haru, on the other hand, continued to pop big wins, including against both Ozeki, but also lose oddball fights to a struggling Tobizaru and upstart Shishi. He managed to stay even with his brother with that nice win over Takerufuji at the end, but it's way more swings and roundabouts with him. And then there's Atami Fuji. He was perhaps the biggest question mark of the Basho going in, non-Shonen no Umi division, and his results reflected that. He lost for the first time in 3 fights to Shodai and the first in 4 to Kinbozan, but took down a streaking Meisei and knocked Shishi off his roll. That put him to 6-5, but his string of 4 losses at the end, and really all of them to some degree, showed a wrestler who's in a disastrous spot if someone gets him moving backwards. It's one thing if the guy having that issue is Kotozakura, who's very good and knows a lot of other ways to get the job done, but Atami also got into really bad positions against Ryuden and Wakamoto Haru that would almost never happen to Koto. It's possible Atami will be another guy who drops out of Makauchi, figures out his game in Juryo, and comes roaring back. Hopefully it doesn't take all that, but he's gotta get better if he's gonna work around his hip issue. Onokatsu. Onokatsu takes a pretty safe upgrade from C+ to B and should probably send a thank you note to the schedule makers. He did fine, starting off 4-0 before slipping to 5-4 behind his first losses to Hakuoho and Asakoryu, but that earned him dates with Atami Fuji, Mitakeumi, and Sada no Umi to carry him to 8 wins. Even after dropping 1 to Oshoma, he managed to finish with 5-8 Ryuden and 5-9 Shirokuma. There's always at least one guy at the end of every Basho who picks up surprisingly weak opposition relative to how he's performing, and this time it was Onokatsu. No disrespect, you still gotta beat the people in front of you, but don't get tricked into assuming he's turned a major corner just because he got 10 wins. He was good, he's still good, nothing's actually changed. C+ Correctamundo is Kirishima and Hiradeumi. I said before the Basho that not 100% Kirishima looks like the regular new Kirishima, and for this Basho at least, that appeared entirely correct. All his wins were against wrestlers he either beats with regularity or who are generally not on his level, even if they've done well against him in the past. I have a feeling he may be consistently inconsistent for a while. Hiradeumi, on the other hand, started out with a rough early schedule and staggered to a 2-4 start. Once he beat Atami Fuji and got his bearings though, he attacked with confidence, and his only loss over the next 8 days was to an Oshoma Henka. That version of Hiradeumi is the one that found his way to Komusubi. If both his health and his confidence in his health hold up, he's probably gonna creep back up the joint. I suspect we'll see a lot of 8 and 7s and some 7 and 8s going forward. C+ dropping to C-. Oho, who hit the bottom end of the 6 to 11 range I posited for him when making the tier list. He looked like an absolute wreck most of the time. It was like what people describe when they talk about an Ozeki hangover or a Yusho hangover, except he didn't make Ozeki and he didn't win a Yusho, he just fell off super hard. And yet, when pride bit him hard enough to make him put it all together, he took down Onosato at a critical point in the Yusho race when it wasn't even clear he'd be a worthy opponent. Yet again, A-tier skills with a D-tier brain. Right alongside him is Kinbozan. I mentioned this in the instant Banzuke, but Kinbozan somehow went 6-9 with an easier than expected schedule despite already expecting a relatively easy schedule. In recent times, the guy just outside the Joy, or number 17 in the division if you prefer counting that way, usually winds up with a few Sanyaku fights because that's just how the schedule goes. Kinbo only got Oho and Kirishima and otherwise routinely fought down in rank. He even beat two of the tougher opponents on his slate in Tamawashi and Hakuoho and still only pulled 6 wins. It's possible he got hurt. His old injuries were focused on the neck, and the way he turned and just ran out of the ring sometimes, that looked like it could have been the issue. But he also didn't have nearly the same kind of fight in him overall as he did in January. Take Oho and give him a somewhat less healthy body, and you basically have Kinbozan. Now let's talk about Abi. I'm tagging Abi as injured. He didn't drop out, but let's be honest, when Ura does this to him, he's not okay. He's very obviously not okay. It was their 16th match, and not once was Ura able to do anything like that in the past. Plus, when a Rikishi starts 4-2, then drops to 6-9 with losses to several opponents he beats more often than not, that's a pretty good indicator something's wrong. Even his late wins showed issues. He didn't get his arms extended against Churanaumi, but Churanaumi is small enough that Abi could still push him. And he showed very little resistance to Takano Sho, he just managed to get out of the way in time for the slapdown. He's had elbow issues in the past, so this isn't shocking, but it is disappointing. And Shonanaumi. I am done. Permanent shrug emoji tier. It's impossible to know when the switch will flip and his body will work correctly. The extreme unpredictability is already enough to throw off other predictions. I think I'm done trying to figure out what he's gonna do too. Okay, time to get into that giant pile of C- picks, so let's start with more positive vibes and get into the overachievers. Top of this list by miles is Churanaumi. He shredded his way to an 8-2 start, which I wouldn't even have guessed if I knew his first 10 opponents ahead of time. I'd have figured absolute maximum best case was 7-3, more likely 6-4. He was a little fortunate to catch Aonishiki while the nerves were still in play, but he beat Ryuden for the first time in 4 tries and Hakuoho for the first time in 3. Ryuden might be falling apart, but the Hakuoho win was a big deal. Then, after pretty expected losses to Takerufuji and Abi, he somehow beat Tamawashi, Takayasu, and Daieisho the last 3 days. And as massively disappointed as I am that the Takayasu match led directly to Papa Bear losing the title, I can't be mad at Chura because he fought brilliantly. The best version of Takayasu took it to him full force, and he battled through it to win. If you look at January's 4-11, then his 8-4 start here, maybe you can chalk a lot of the difference up to a downgraded schedule. But those last 3 wins with just genuinely very good sumo? When I predicted a strong performance from him in January, this is the guy I expected to show up. Watching this, it's hard to understand how the 4-11 at rank 9 was even possible. Maybe he was hurt, and he's just so under the radar that no one even bothers collecting injury information on him. I don't know. Hell of a job, though. Bouncing from C- to B with the most utterly bonkers set of results is Tamawashi. Set aside the whole year of 8-7s and 7-8s that made him seem like a permanent coin flip. He had 10 wins in March, 7 of which were against wrestlers who finished with winning records, 6 of whom ended with 9 wins. But 3 of his losses were to guys with losing records, and the other 2 were to Churanaumi and Tokihayate, who were on unbelievable rolls, but don't exactly strike major fear into anyone's hearts. It was a roller coaster, but at least it was a fun one. The thing I like about Tamawashi is that he's the ultimate lunch pail guy. Comes to work every day with his brown bag full of sandwiches and does the same thing because he likes it. As long as it's good enough, he'll keep coming to work. If it ever stops being good enough, he'll go do something else. And his world has somehow started evolving into his methods rather than away from them. I hope he retires before it all falls apart because I think it would be too much of a shock for some of us to see him actually look old on the dohyo. Next up is a batch of C- picks who managed 9 wins. Fairness demands I upgrade them to C+, but it's not a coincidence all of them were in the low single-digit or high double-digit ranks because that put them in line to fight Nishikigi, Shonanaumi, and Takerufuji. It's not that they didn't have their moments. For example, after Oshoma turned his 0-4 start into a 6-5 record off wins over all 3 of them, also struggling Shodai and Kinbozan and his Hirota Umi Henka, he had genuinely impressive wins over Onokatsu and Wakataka Kage. Then he, I don't know, respected his elders or some shit against Ryuden on day 15. Whatever. 9 wins, good job. Meisei's big run came early rather than late. He went up against all 3 mega struggle buses in the first 4 days, actually dropping the first one to Takarafuji before running his record to 6-2 and looking more like the Meisei who used to batter Sanyaku opponents than he has at any point since maybe last May. Yeah, he dropped some matches, and he needed wins over late Basho Mitakeyumi and Chiyo Shoma to reach 9, but he put on quite a show for the first 2/3 of the tournament. Midori Fuji couldn't fight Takarafuji because they're stablemates, so he only got to fight Shona and Nishikigi. But it's a good thing he got them because they were the only 2 wins he managed in the first 5 days. But after he hit 6-6 following 3 straight losses, he looked terrific in wins over Asakoryu, Sadanoumi, and Mitakeyumi to finish. The Mitakeyumi win was especially nice. Yeah, Mitakeyumi struggles badly at the end of tournaments now, but it was more because Midori went in, executed his plan perfectly, and had 0 hesitation. It was the first time he'd secured a winning record before day 15 since July, and the first time he'd actually won 8 matches without walkovers since the end of 2023. And that last day, he looked like someone who'd shed a weight off his back. Regardless of how the next Banzuke turns out, he's going to be surrounded by tough matches, so hopefully this can give him a boost. The last guy getting the C+ upgrade is Shishi, and I'm setting him apart from the other 3 because he only faced Takarafuji, not Nishikigi or Shona no Umi. The scheduling upside for him was getting to pick on the bottom of the division. His Onokatsu win was nice, but once Aonishiki and Meisei dropped him to 4-3, it looked very much like this was going to be a 7 or 8 win Basho. But that came at the exact moment where Koto Shoho, Asakoryu, and Mitakeyumi got bumped up to face him, and suddenly, wow, he's 7-3. But to his credit, the difference between 8 and 9 wins was beating Wakamoto Haru, something I doubt many people saw coming. Outside of that surprise though, his Basho went pretty much as a person might expect given his opposition. I would say May will show us if his kinda floppy, awkward style is actually pretty good now, but if he's in a neighborhood with Kinbozan, Meisei, Shodai, Endo, Atami Fuji, and Takano Sho, more will probably depend on if his opponents are, functional. Believe it or not, we actually did hit on some of these picks. Gonoyama remains oddly good against Oho and Kirishima and was fortunate to see Abi when Abi was physically collapsing, but he still only found 7 wins. Ura was also pretty fortunate to hit 7 since he picked up the Fusen win when Hoshoryu dropped out, also ran into the malfunctioning Abi, and won what's become a coin flip match with Tobizaru. Tobi got torched even worse by the Sanyaku than expected, but still squeaked out 6 wins by finally figuring out how to beat Gonoyama and remembering how to beat Wakamoto Haru. Ryuden hung onto his spot in Makauchi by tricky bastarding his way to 6-9. Sadanoumi won all the matches he should have, and the only bad-looking loss was to Shona no Umi, so he was pretty much exactly who we expected him to be. Shodai, okay look, I said he would beat 3 guys he shouldn't and lose to 3 guys he should beat. He was 0-2 against Atami Fuji and won. 6-9 against Ura, won. Lost 3 of the last 4 to Midori Fuji, won. I mean, granted, his losses were all the guys he struggles with or hadn't fought before, since I guess that's where he is in his career now, but hey, I can claim to being half right. And Endo, okay. I'm sure a lot of you who watched every day saw that about halfway through the tournament, he started having trouble getting up after just about every match, win or lose. I saw concerns he had a concussion, maybe a bad back, it was hard to tell. But after his day 2 match here, he just flopped over. He may well have taken another injury later, but every time he hopped off the dohyo, even early on, he flopped into the crowd. His knees must have been a mess. Yet he somehow started 4-0, and more unbelievable still was this win over Tamawashi on day 9. It looks like it took years off his life to pull that move. This should be a massive concern, and it kinda is, but somehow he'll have bashos where he looks like a shell of himself, and the next one it's like nothing's wrong. We'll see if he has another miracle in him come May. I don't know how much time we need to spend on the failbots that dropped into D tier. Takano Sho deserves some attention at least. I thought he might get out to a decent start since he wouldn't face the Sanyaku right away, but the first 3 days were rough. He lost for the first time to Ichi Yamamoto and only the 3rd time in 9 fights against Ura. Beating Oho and Kotozakura got him to 2-3, and those were signs of life, but after that, oof. I suppose he can at least point to getting hit with an ungodly difficult schedule despite his record. After struggling to 2-6, he got Hiroda Umi, Kirishima, who he ended up beating, Wakamoto Haru, Wakatakakage, and Abi. The Abi fight was especially rough because when it got scheduled, Takakeisho was 3-8 and already guaranteed a losing record. It's not uncommon for high Maegashira wrestlers to skip Sanyaku fights when they're already Maki Koshi, but Abi was only 4-7, so by the numbers it was a reasonable matchup. Then, instead of facing one of the other disasters in the last 2 days, or even someone like Shodai, he got fellow Joy members Chiyoshima and Gonoyama. They also had losing records, so by normal scheduling practices, these were not unusual pairings, but it was too much for Takakeisho. If it helps the big thick fans out there, obviously he wasn't fighting at his best, but as long as this was just a bad basho and there wasn't some particular injury we're not hearing about, besides his blown ACL of course, the big ranking drop he's about to eat might let him pull it together again in May. The other three are just, what are you gonna do? Nishikigi might not have the same thyroid problem as Shona Naomi, but whether it's drinking too much or something else, he's just as all over the place. He's going in shrug emoji tier 2. I'll make a generic guess as to how they'll do, but I'm not making any predictions about either of them anymore. Takarafuji. I'm more sad for Takarafuji. He was clearly trying, and just as clearly being failed by his body. Nothing worked, nothing was going to work. There's a fairly common occurrence in sumo where a guy struggles really badly, but as long as he's not suffering through a clear injury or something else that's obviously sapping his ability to fight, he makes a comeback in later days and winds up not looking terrible overall. Even if he's not winning, he's at least putting up a good battle. Takarafuji looked as done gets. That doesn't mean he won't have another miraculous revival in Juryo, but I can't think of anyone who's recently looked like they can hold their own and then half a year later or less turned into this. And Shirokuma just ain't got it at this level, not yet. None of his wins were impressive, and he was the only guy with a losing record against the Shona, Nishikigi, Takarafuji trio. He's big and strong enough that he should be better than this. Maybe one more trip to Juryo will help him figure out what he's missing. The better question is how long he needs to stay there for it to happen. Finishing up C tier. Nishiki Fuji got hurt on the second day, so that's a wash. For the injury tier guys, Kotoshoho looked basically okay, like he's still working his way back but isn't acutely injured anymore. And Matakayumi had another strong start that he couldn't turn into more. 6-9 may not seem awful, but if not for fights with Takarafuji and Nishikigi near the end, he probably would have finished 4-11. We know he's not going to stop fighting, but it's starting to look like whatever's wrong may not heal before he crashes entirely out of the sport. Last, but in one case not least, the D tier picks. Unusually, Chiyoshima and especially Asakoryu looked like they might break out of this tier before staying put. Chiyoshima was 3-2 after his Henkaboshi, which was extraordinary, but the Sanyaku weren't the only tough fights Chiyo was stuck with, and near the end he wound up being one of the high-ranking Maegashira with a poor record scheduled against lower-ranked wrestlers with good records. And, unfortunately, Chiyo's not better than Hirodeumi or Meisei. It's a better outcome than I would have expected with that schedule, but still kinda oof. Asakoryu kept the hot streak going longer, grinding to 6-4 after 10 days and staring down a matchup with a very meh Shirokuma for number 7. But Shiro's one of his worst matchups, and the last 4 days were against a suite of opponents he'd never beaten. He still hasn't. Very unfortunate, but at least it looks like he'll maintain a spot in Makuuchi and have another chance to show he belongs. Ichi Yamamoto squeaks his way up to C- with a final day win over Takarafuji, but he didn't luck box his way into a nearly 50-50 record. The worst you can say about his 6-4 start is that normal Hoshoryu wouldn't have blown that fight. He's oddly good against Hirodeumi, and his other 4 wins were against opponents struggling to one degree or another. But those guys were still the competition he had to face at a career-high rank, and that's never easy. However, at 4 West, his schedule was always going to be harder near the end. Most of the rest of the Sanyaku came calling, plus Tobizaru, and they blew up his chances at Akachi Koshi. I kinda wanted to see a last day Abi-Ichi fight, but considering how busted Abi was, maybe it wouldn't have been as fun as I hoped. And now let's talk Time Storm, by which I mean Tokihayate. That's the translation of his name. It's f***ing awesome. Anyway, he jumps all the way to B tier, but the big question is, obviously, how did he do this? Aonishiki's the new hotness, and Churaneumi had shown this game at this level in the past. But even knowing I might have been underestimating Toki to some degree, where did this type of performance come from? It's not like he ran over the bottom of the division. At 18 East, he fought basically from the bottom up and only started 4-4. Nishiki Fuji's exit landed him a Juryo fight with Tamashoho, who he spanks regularly. Shirokuma, Asakoryu, and Sadanoumi are all coin flip fights for him, but fortunately he took all 3. On the flip side, he lost to Deituma Takayumi, who's always tough, Aonishiki, Midori Fuji, and a reasonably healthy Kotoshoho. None of those are surprising. After that, he might have been fighting a 7-1 Churanaumi, but the win over Churanaumi was his 3rd straight. He got another Juryo fight on day 10. Ironically, Churanaumi would have had that fight, but they don't give Juryo fights to guys who are that far up and are also 7-1. Then he got another win against Ryuten. He normally struggles against Shonen Umi, but, yeah. Just like that, he's 8-4. So he secured a winning record on day 12 without doing anything really too out there for him. He's improving, sure, but none of the individual results up to that point were a surprise. Beating Meisei and Tamawashi, of course, were definitely wow kind of moments. Even then though, the win against Meisei didn't require anything special. It was just a core move well executed. He pulled hard enough to snap Meisei's hand off his belt, and Meisei couldn't hang on. Then Tamawashi beat his ass all over the ring, but he kept his cool, stuck with it, and timed a parry at the rope brilliantly for the win. On the one hand, it speaks well for Toki that he didn't have to find a whole new, unsustainable gear to produce these results. His normal sumo made it happen. He did a terrific job staying focused and giving himself the best possible chance to win. On the other hand, 2 of those 10 wins were against Juryo regs who he normally wrecks, and if he lands at Maegashira 13 as expected, he won't get any of those next time. As with Shishi, he's landing in a Banzuke spot in May where a lot of opponents with questionable health will surround him, so there will be a pretty good range of possible results. I suspect he'll do fine, and he's probably in the division to stay, but it wouldn't be a shock if he bounces down to Juryo once more before he really locks in his place in the top division. And that's the tier list recap for March 2025. It's always an experience looking back at predictions after a bunch of guys fall apart and hand out free wins like the green flavored candy nobody wants, but things didn't turn out too badly for all that. There's no obvious video to make in the near future, so maybe I'll make one about predictions or another breakdown, I don't know. If you have any ideas, leave them in the comments. Other than that, have a great day, and I'll see you soon.